Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be continuing with our series, Dumbfounding Definitions, Dizzying Distinctions, and Diabolical Doctrines, a series sorting through some of the jargon of philosophy. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at what is the fallacy of necessitation. Now, the fallacy of necessitation is a combination of the fallacy of wishful thinking and the fallacy of circular reasoning. Check out our videos on those for more. Specifically, this fallacy justifies the assumptions that we need to make in order to do a particular task, in virtue of the fact that we need such assumptions to do that task. Often, a particular discipline or a certain type of reasoning takes the form of, if we didn't assume claim X, we couldn't do some intellectual activity Y that we want to do, therefore X is justified. It can plague any number of disciplines, from philosophy to science. This is not to say that these disciplines are necessarily themselves unjustified, or the claims are unjustified, but rather to say that this methodology for justifying them, of saying we have to assume this because if we didn't assume this, we couldn't do whatever it is, are fallacious methods of justification. Let's take a look. So, often this will be a central fallacy underlying the justification of a basic axiom of a discipline. If we don't assume X, we can't do economics or cosmology, so we must assume X. If we don't assume that happiness can be measured in terms of money, we can't do economics, so it must be measurable. Check out our videos on critiquing willingness of pay for more on that claim. If we don't assume that the laws of the universe behave the same here as they do in other parts of the universe, we can't do cosmology, so they must behave the same. Cosmology is a particularly problematic version of this because there's nothing really we have to justify that, because we can't take measurements all over the universe. We're only able to take measurements here and what we're able to observe here. And so if the laws of the universe act differently in other parts of the universe, if an observer in a different part of the universe would see things differently than we would here, then all of our assumptions about cosmology fall apart, and we can't actually do cosmology. Sometimes these conclusions are not stated explicitly, but rather wrapped up in the work of the discipline itself, so that you may not realize that when cosmology claims that the universe is a quarter dark matter, or something like that, that is based on the assumptions that are required to do cosmology, that when observed from a large enough scale, the properties of the universe are the same no matter from where they are observed. Essentially, that the rules that apply here apply everywhere. The problem is that we can't justify these assumptions beyond the claim that if they weren't true, we couldn't do cosmology. Because if the rules behave very, very differently somewhere else, and we can't measure how those rules behave somewhere else, we couldn't do cosmology. We couldn't make conclusions about other parts of the universe that we're never going to be able to measure. Such assumptions cannot be critiqued within the discipline themselves, as they are required to do the discipline. Those assumptions are needed in order for you to do the discipline in the first place, which is why it often falls to philosophy to critique them, the kind of glue that functions in between multiple disciplines. Perhaps the clearest example of this fallacy shows up in religion. In order to do Christianity, we need to assume the Bible is true, therefore the Bible is true. People like to do religion, but in order to justify the practice of religion, it's necessary that they assume that a particular holy text is true, and so they do. This justification is built on several fallacies. As I said, this is a combination fallacy. It's the fallacy of wishful thinking, because they are justifying the truth of a claim based on their desire that the claim is true, specifically their desire to do the thing that the claim being true allows them to do. It's circular reasoning, because the truth of the holy text is justified by the fact that the holy text claims itself to be truthful. And, most specifically, it's the fallacy of necessitation, because in order to do theology, we need to assume a particular holy text is true. Therefore, that holy text must be true so that we can do theology. Note that many philosophers of religion do not use these fallacious techniques to justify their views, but others do. The problem here with this fallacy is not necessarily the claims that it is used to justify, but rather this method of justifying a claim. Scientific realism is sometimes justified in terms of this fallacy as well. If we don't assume that induction is a way to provide legitimate justification for a claim, then we can't do science. At least we can't do scientific realism. As noted above, this is sometimes the justification from within the discipline. Philosophers of science are the ones that ask the questions about whether these fundamental axioms can be justified without assuming that the discipline itself is justified. Assuming that science is justified because that's the only way we can do science begs the question against the skeptic and commits the wishful thinking fallacy, because we want to do science and therefore we must assume these axioms must be true because we want to do science. By justifying the truth of a claim based on our desire that it's true, we commit the wishful thinking fallacy. Again, this combination of begging the question or circular reasoning and wishful thinking fallacy gives us the fallacy of necessitation. Even philosophy has its own version of this fallacy, though it can look somewhat different. In philosophy, this is more commonly a justification for keeping philosophy in a place of privilege in a perfect society or a perfect life. It's not to say that philosophy doesn't deserve that place of privilege, but depending on the theory, this can seem often shoehorned in a way that seems to just be there to justify the fact that the philosopher wanted to keep doing philosophy, and if they constructed a view of the perfect life that didn't include a spot for them to keep doing philosophy, they might have to quit philosophy. Philosophers are in a unique position to make arguments about the perfect society or how life should be. But simply because philosophers are the ones that are coming up with such a society, it doesn't follow that such a society should include or emphasize philosophy. However, many philosophers make this case because they want to justify their own choice to do philosophy as good or worthwhile. When a philosopher crafts a theory of how to do good, they must provide an explanation of why they're sitting writing philosophy instead of going out and doing good in the world. So there's often some kind of carve-out for philosophers. This tradition goes all the way back to Plato, who advocated for philosopher kings, putting philosophers at the center of a perfect society. Members of the effective altruism movement often bend over backwards to both advocate for people earning to give, i.e. entering high-earning fields to give the most that they can to charity, while also explaining how philosophers that advocate for this position are not therefore leaving philosophy and then earning to give as much as they could in a higher income field. The question is, why are you still doing philosophy if what you're advocating for is to do something other than philosophy? If you think a good life is something other than philosophy, and so you have to add this carve out to allow for yourself, which seems like we are baking in an assumption in order to do the thing that we want to do, which sounds a lot like the fallacy of necessitation. So here's some examples. In order to practice law in this country, we must assume that the dictator's laws are justified. Therefore, the dictator's laws are justified. Once again, they may not be justified laws. You might need to use them in order to practice law, but that doesn't make them true. The only way that we can figure out how to eat healthily is to assume that labels on food are true. Therefore, the labels on food are true. Now, I'm not trying to cast doubt on food labels here, but rather to say this is a bad argument for the case that the food labels are true. Just because something is the only source of information for you to draw conclusions doesn't mean that it's true. It may mean that it's the best option that you have and you may want to make decisions based on it, but it doesn't mean that it's true or that you should accept it. Simply because something's the best of bad options doesn't mean that it's true. And finally, I have a philosophical theory that requires that you to spend all of your time in service of poor. In order to make up philosophical theories, I need to spend some time not in service of the poor. Therefore, it's justifiable to allow people to either spend all their time in service of the poor or in doing philosophy. Once again, there are some philosophical theories where this feels more natural, where this carve-out for philosophy doesn't feel kind of ad hoc and added on, but there are a number where it does, where it feels like, oh, we have this perfect, beautiful, streamlined theory, and then the philosopher realizes, ooh, I need to have something that allows for me to keep doing philosophy in here that doesn't feel like it fits with the rest of the theory. So, note that this fallacy only applies to the truth of claims, not necessarily your moral responsibility or what you should do. Rather, it's an epistemic responsibility of what you should think or believe. We often must decide to take some action based on incomplete information, imperfect models, and assumptions, since in many cases not acting would have equal or greater consequences. That's why this is a complaint for scientific realism, not necessarily instrumentalism. However, simply because we lack perfect information, it doesn't follow that those claims are true or that we should not suspend judgment on them. Food labels may be the best of bad options to decide how to eat healthfully. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily true, but using them may still be permissible. Once again, using it as an example, not trying to cast doubt on food labels specifically here. Cosmology may be the best of bad options to try to navigate a deep space telescope, but that doesn't mean that we have any proof that the laws of the universe are going to behave the same light years away from us. Being the only option, or the best of bad options, does not make something true, but it may be a useful tool for taking action. And this is where people can get confused here, because you may be using something to take action, but that doesn't justify it. And so trying to use that subtle tweak of, oh, science is useful, cosmology is useful, therefore it's true, causes you all sorts of problems and commits this fallacy. What do you think? Are there instances of this fallacy that you've seen in your life? Is this a unique fallacy, or do you think it's just instances of wishful thinking and circular reasoning together and not something unique on its own? Do you know any philosophers that bend their theories to allow for people who do philosophy in a way that it doesn't seem natural, it doesn't seem like it fits into the philosophy? It feels ad hoc, added on. It feels like it's committing this fallacy by trying to justify philosophy just for the sake of justifying philosophy, not because it's actually the way to be living a good life. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Watch this video and more here at Carneades.org, and stay skeptical, everybody.